Hello, the Dark Side community. Tonight I want to share with you what happened to me in 2018 when I was 20 years old. Ever since I was a child, I have been sensitive to paranormal phenomena. Nowadays I am a homemaker. I am married and expecting my first baby. Back then I was working full-time as a bartender in a bar that looked more like a cantina, but I was doing well. I was doing what I liked, listening to the people who came in, like any good bartender, and the pay, along with the tips, was not bad at all. One October night, I got off work a little later than usual. I was not worried because the bar was literally around the corner from my house, just a few steps away. That night, while tidying up and cleaning everything, I heard the sound of a marble bouncing on the floor in the farthest part of the bar. I did not pay much attention because all I wanted was to go home, and it was already 1 o'clock in the morning by the time I arrived at my house. Everything went completely normally after that. I took a shower, put on my pajamas, and went to bed. At that time, I used to sleep with my dog, a pit bull, but later that night, during what was left of it, his barking woke me up. This was a very different kind of bark compared to his usual one when he wanted to go out to the bathroom at night. I woke up, and as I got out of bed, I noticed my dog was barking at something or someone at my bedroom door. The door was open as I always left it, because sometimes he liked to leave the room and go sleep in the living room or somewhere else. But again, his barking was different this time. When I finally stood up, I saw that he looked at me and then barked again toward the doorway, his tail tucked between his legs. I walked with him to the door, and at that moment it seemed my dog gathered his courage. Perhaps because he felt I was with him, or maybe he felt it was his duty to protect me. He started barking a bit more forcefully while moving next to me. Although I was confused, I could not pinpoint anything strange until we reached the dining room. That is when I saw a tall shadow heading toward the kitchen, the shadow of someone I could not make out. I decided to follow it, but my dog did not want to go any farther. He stayed in the dining room, staring at me intently as I walked away, leaving him behind. My curiosity in that moment was stronger than me, the need to be absolutely sure no one else was in the house with us. When I got to the kitchen, what I saw in front of me made me freeze. I could not even scream. It was a woman with long black hair, wearing a white nightgown so long it covered her feet. But community, what truly shocked me, what really made me feel like I was about to faint from fear, was that she did not have a lower jaw, only the upper part of her face. I stood there staring, unable to move, and she did nothing. She was just there, motionless. I felt like I had lost the ability to move even the slightest bit, until that woman, or that thing, moved an arm. She moved it toward me, and in that moment I snapped out of it. I moved and shouted for my mom and my sister. Both of them woke up and came running to me. I was crying uncontrollably. I could not stop. I could not speak. I could not stop crying. They kept telling me to talk, to say if something had happened to me, but I just could not control myself. I was in really bad shape. After a few minutes, once I calmed down a bit, I told them, though vaguely, what had happened, what I believed I had seen. Naturally, they did not believe me. It is hard to believe someone who claims to have just seen a ghost, especially in a place where nothing like that had ever happened before. They just told me to sleep with the light on for the night and that if anything else happened during the week, to bring it up in the morning at the university. At that time, I was also a student. The next morning, I felt extremely tired at school and could not stop thinking about what had happened. I kept questioning whether I had really dreamed it, but at the same time it did not seem logical, because I was fully aware that my dog had barked and that he had been with me the whole time. After classes, I went to work at the bar as usual. I started my normal routine. I arranged the chairs, wiped down the tables, and when I finished, I still had plenty of time before the first customers arrived. So I went over to play some music on the jukebox. But before I got there, I heard that same marble again. A marble clearly dropping from somewhere in the bar. I looked around everywhere, listening carefully to identify where the sound might be coming from, but found no sign of what could have caused it. The days went by, and so did the nights when my dog would bark again toward the open door, frightened. All I could do was start closing my bedroom door and try to ignore him, terrified of seeing something like that again, terrified that something might really be out there. I remember what happened next very clearly because Halloween was approaching and the bar was decorated for it. One night there were no customers and I still had some time left in my shift. I told my sister to come join me at the bar so I would not be alone. Something about that night made me not want to stay there by myself. My sister arrived and we were chatting. Then, in a moment of silence, she also heard it. The marble falling from somewhere in the back of the bar, in an empty area. She asked me if I had heard it too, or if it was just her imagination. The truth is, it was the first time I felt somewhat relieved, because another person besides me had heard that sound. Now I knew it was real. When we went to check the back area, I told my sister that I had heard this sound several times before but had never found anything. Music. A few minutes later, we heard a lot of noise outside on the street. We went out immediately to see what was happening. A guy who worked in a nearby shop warned us not to stay outside, to go back in, because someone had just robbed a business nearby. When we heard this, I quickly called my boss to tell him about the situation and asked him to come over, since he always looked out for me. I did not hesitate to call him in that situation. When my boss arrived, my sister and I told him what had happened outside. She encouraged me to tell him about the marble, even though it seemed like a small detail. Although I felt a bit embarrassed, I told him too. I explained everything that had been happening. After listening, he assured me that nobody could be haunting that place. He said Christian music was always playing on a small hidden speaker in the bar. Then, he showed me the small speaker and the Christian music playing at such a low volume that you could only hear it when there was complete silence. Any regular customer-requested music would drown it out entirely. Then he said something. Perhaps what I heard, what I assumed was a marble, was actually something divine trying to warn me about what was going to happen outside. I was not entirely convinced by his explanation. I felt there was something more behind that sound, something that did not seem good to me. Halloween and the Day of the Dead went by without incident, although I was worried that these inexplicable events, which were starting to follow me, might be more frequent on those dates. But nothing happened until November 3rd, when I arrived at work as usual and started to clean. Before I explain what happened, I want to clarify a few details. On the wall across from the bar, my boss had installed a shelf very high up. In fact, I had to climb a ladder to clean it. On that shelf, he kept a small altar with a picture of Saint Martin de Porres, a statue of Saint Jude Thaddeus, flowers, and their corresponding votive candles. That afternoon, I was at the bar cleaning on top of the refrigerator, and while I was doing so, I felt that someone, or something, had walked in. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw the tail of a small black dog. I got excited because I love animals, and I thought it was a stray dog that sometimes came to see me and that I would feed. However, when I peeked out, I realized there was nothing there. Then I remembered that the stray dog I knew had a white tail, and there were no other dogs in that area, at least none that I had seen. So, it did not make any sense. I felt puzzled, but I decided to keep cleaning. Only a few seconds went by when I again caught sight of that black tail near the bar. I got distracted and looked around completely, and that was when, in an exaggeratedly violent way, the entire altar my boss had on the shelf went flying off, as if something had hurled it with intense force and fury. The impact was so great that I could not even scream. I was in shock, and it was 3 o'clock in the afternoon with people out on the streets. It was not nighttime, nor was it an especially creepy setting for something like this to happen. At that moment, all I could do was call my sister and then call my boss. I was so shaken up that I was crying uncontrollably. I immediately left the place and waited outside for either of them to arrive. My sister got there first. She asked, "What happened to you? Are you okay? Did someone do something to you? Did they try to rob you? You look so pale. Please tell me something." I could only cry. I did not know how to explain what had happened. Then we went in together, and when I saw the mess inside, she asked me again, Tell me the truth. They robbed you, right? I shook my head. No. And as best I could, I explained. Something threw the altar down from up there, but it was thrown. It did not just fall. It was tossed violently. I was very upset, and she kept asking who had done it. I could only reply that nobody physical had done it. I told her I did not know how, but something had knocked it over. I felt that whatever was there was not good. We started cleaning up everything that had fallen, everything that was broken. My sister realized it had not simply fallen. In fact, something must have hurled those things because there were pieces of the vase and the votive glass all the way out on the street. A few minutes later, my boss arrived. He found us cleaning, very worried, and asked what had happened. My sister gave him a brief explanation as I was still pretty quiet, still trying to process what had occurred. My boss helped us clean and told us not to be afraid to talk about it. He said he did believe in these things, but found it strange that it was happening in this place, and that it only seemed to be happening to me, no one else. I did not know how to answer him because I did not know why all of this was happening to me either. We kept cleaning, and my boss picked up the statue of St. Jude Thaddeus. Surprisingly, it was intact. It did not even have a scratch or a crack, but the head was missing. It was as if something had cut it off cleanly. We searched everywhere for the missing head, even outside, but nobody could find it. I want everyone to pay attention to this if something similar has happened to any of you. My boss told me that when something like that happens with religious statues, it is undoubtedly a bad omen, a sign that something bad is near. That afternoon, he stayed with me until I finished my shift. That night, I could not sleep. I had many nightmares, and the next morning I felt completely exhausted. I was very distracted at the university. Even though I did not want to go back to work, I could not bring myself to just quit overnight. I felt indebted to my boss for everything he had done for me. The days went by and I still could not sleep. My dog kept barking at something outside the bedroom, and I would just hide under my blankets, not wanting to see, not wanting to face whatever was out there. More than once, I pulled my dog under the covers with me so he would stop looking at whatever was scaring him. Maybe it was because of the lack of sleep, or maybe it was because of the events happening, but I felt increasingly sensitive, drained, and without energy. As time passed, everything seemed to calm down at the bar. We no longer heard strange noises. But then something extremely odd happened. My boss found the missing head of the St. Jude Thaddeus statue right on top of the bar, as if someone had left it there. One night around 8 o'clock, I was left without any customers. The few who had been there all left at almost the same time. That made me nervous, but then I reminded myself that my shift would end at 9 o'clock this time. I began to collect empty beer mugs on the bar, took them to the little kitchen to wash them, and as soon as I placed them in the sink, someone knocked over one of the chairs behind me. I turned around quickly, and at that exact moment the kitchen faucet turned on by itself. It might sound insignificant from the outside, but to me, it was proof that I was not alone in that place, that this was not over, that there was something there with me, close to me, constantly pursuing me. All I could do was hide in the women's bathroom and cry out of fear and desperation, because I could not understand why these things were happening to me. Once I pulled myself together, I thought about calling my boss, but I realized I had left my phone out on the bar, and I did not have the courage to go back out there. My boss was typically very punctual, always arriving exactly at 9 o'clock, and I figured he would still take a while to get there. I thought it must have been just 8:15. I stayed there, not moving, squeezing my eyes shut, waiting for time to pass and pass and pass. I do not know how long it actually was, but it was not very long when suddenly, I finally heard him arrive. I felt as if he was my savior. Our relationship was extremely respectful, but in that moment I came out of the bathroom and hugged him, crying. He asked if something bad had happened, why the chair was on the floor, why the faucet was on. I took a deep breath and tried to explain what had happened. He just looked at me and said that this was definitely not good anymore, that whatever it was seemed to be getting more physical. He told me he knew a senora, a healer, and that he had tried not to go to that extreme, but now it was time to call her, that maybe she could help us, help me. According to him, she did cleanses using good spirits, although I did not fully understand how it worked. He called her right away and asked for an appointment. She agreed to see me, especially when we told her what was happening, and she said it was urgent. She would see me first thing the next day. After he got off the phone, my boss tried to calm me down. He said everything would be all right. He knew a bit about these matters, had gone through some things, and at least for the moment, he was going to do a quick cleanse on me with a cigarette to help me relax. He smoked a lot, so he lit several cigarettes and used the smoke on me, explaining that it would not get rid of whatever was following me, but it would help me sleep more peacefully that night. And indeed, I do not know how to explain it, but that night, I was finally able to rest. The next day, I missed my classes at the university. My boss picked me up at 7 in the morning and we went to the Senora's house. She attended to us right away. My boss stayed in the waiting area while I went into a room filled with statues of saints, votive candles, and images. At first, I was skeptical, thinking these people just tell you what you want to hear based on what you tell them. But I was wrong. As soon as I sat down, she only asked for my name and date of birth and then suddenly started describing what was happening to me. She explained that I was someone who went out alone a lot, that I had a kind soul, and that made me very sensitive to these kinds of situations. So even if it was resolved, it was likely not going to be the last time. She told me I had brought back a restless spirit. When she said that, I asked, "A restless spirit? Really?" The Senora went on, "That is right, my child. It is a restless spirit, a woman, and it seems she found you, or you found her, on your way home in early October. She really liked your energy because physically, you are very similar. She recognized herself in you. She is your height, has long black hair, and a similar build. She was about 54 years old when she died." I was speechless. I just listened, unable to believe what she was telling me. It was truly astonishing and, in a way, more terrifying than I had imagined. The Senora also said, "This restless spirit died in a very violent way. She does not have a mouth, correct?" I responded that yes, I had seen her in my house and she did not have the lower part of her mouth. She did not have a jaw. The Senora told me, "She wants to steal your energy, and she is managing to do so. At this point, you and she are almost one and the same. That is why you feel so tired, why you have no energy. She wants to stay with you, to take over your physical body. That is the source of those harsh attacks you have been experiencing. If we do not stop it now, they will become more intense. She is stronger. I recommend that you stay away from fire and from sharp objects. Also, please avoid dark areas. Try to sleep with a light on. She is going to fill you with fear to weaken you to stay with you." When she finished speaking, she performed a cleanse on me using several things and told me that someone dear to me needed to give me a quartz crystal in the color of my choice, which I would have to carry everywhere and never let anyone else touch it. After we left, the Senora told my boss to take good care of me and he just nodded. He drove me home and said he would see me later at the bar. The truth is, I did feel different, lighter and calmer. When I got home, I told my mom and my sister everything the Senora had explained, and finally, my mom believed me somehow. That day when I arrived at the bar, my boss arrived at the same time. As we went in, everything was exactly as he had left it the night before, except for one thing. On the outside of the bar, where customers usually sit, there was a name carved into the wood with something very thin, like it had been scratched in with a needle. It was a woman's name. The two of us, both scared and nervous, and with our emotions running high, agreed it had to be the name of that restless spirit. My boss was extremely cautious and strict with the furniture, and his regular customers knew that well, especially those who sat in that spot by the bar all the time. They were friends, people who were always there, and they knew they could not damage anything. Besides, my boss had closed early the night before, so it was impossible for anyone to have gone in after closing to carve it. I prefer not to write it or even say it out loud, but I will never forget that name. Whenever I hear it in any context in life, it still fills me with fear. Time passed and I followed the Mrs. Healer's instructions. I am fortunate now to say that things got much better. My sister gave me the quartz crystal the Mrs. recommended. I was surprised to see that sometimes it turned very, very dark or brownish, even though it had originally been blue. Over time, I changed jobs, and we also moved to a new house. That woman, or that restless spirit, never came back. At least I have not seen her again. As for me, I will always hold on to my blue quartz. I never, ever go anywhere without it. Hello everyone. I have been listening to The Dark Side for a while now, and today I finally found the courage to share my story. What I am about to tell you is one of those stories that is passed down in the family, and in fact, it belongs more to my grandmother than to me. She told it to me only once, but I have never been able to forget it. It is terrifying, especially because many of our family's tragedies began from that point on. My grandmother was about 16 years old at the time, and she had 6 siblings. She had an older sister who was only 1 year older than her, so they were always together. People would say they even looked like twins. This story happened one day when there was no one else at home, just the 2 of them. My grandmother invited 2 friends over, and they began to play with a Ouija board. My grandmother told me that everything started off normally with simple questions such as, "Am I going to have money when I grow up?" You know, those boring kinds of questions. My grandmother did not believe in it much, and she was not having as much fun as she had imagined. There were no interesting answers. So, she quickly got bored and said she did not want to play anymore, that they should do something else. Right at that moment, they heard a door move, something that had never happened before in that house. There was no one else at home, nor were there any drafts, so her sister took it as a sign that someone had arrived, something the board had brought. Then her sister asked a strange question, something she never should have asked. "When am I going to die?" The Ouija board answered, "At 27. They all fell silent, and now they truly stopped playing, very frightened. A few days went by, and my grandmother's father had a serious accident on the highway while returning from Guadalajara. He crashed into a trailer, and his car fell into a canal. Someone was with him too. It was the father of one of my grandmother's friends, one of the ones who had played with the Ouija that day. That man died. He was decapitated. My grandmother's father was in very bad shape. There was a moment when they thought he would not survive because, among many injuries, the teeth from his lower jaw had become embedded in his flesh. He spent several months recovering, but he managed to pull through. Shortly after that, they received word that the father of the other friend had been found hanging in his house. He was a very hard worker and did not have any apparent problems, so the death was very strange. At this point, you might think these were just coincidences, a matter of suggestion, connecting things that might not be related at all. But then the predicted date arrived. Her sister was now 27 years old. She had 1 daughter and had just given birth to her 2nd child. The day after giving birth, she felt very weak, so they took her to the hospital. My grandmother says her sister seemed to be improving and that every hour, a nurse, a nun, would come in to check on her. Then, when the shift changed, another nurse came in, someone my grandmother had never seen. She had a white uniform, blue eyes, and skin so pale that it stood out in my grandmother's memory. My grandmother left the room while they gave her sister a blood transfusion, and according to her, that was her biggest mistake. Only a few minutes after she stepped out, her sister started feeling worse and worse until she finally passed away. The cause of death was poisoning. They had given her blood of the wrong type. But the nightmare did not end there. A few weeks later, my grandmother's youngest brother died after being run over by a truck. Over time, when she was older, my grandmother found out that both of her friends, the ones who had played with the Ouija board, had died some years before, both of the same illness, stomach cancer. Today, my grandmother is 74 years old, and I want to believe that nothing has happened to her because maybe, just maybe, her punishment for having played was to bear the weight of all those deaths. I have tried to get her to tell me more details about what happened, but she always says those are things that happened in the past and should be left behind. She is usually very reserved about everything, but only when she told me this story did I ever hear her voice tremble. Thank you all for listening to my story. Good night.